we go, record.
More people from.
I'm not sure.
Where's all that?
Do you want me to go run around?
Can you just check and round them up, please?
Michelle was the only other in-person staff member I've seen today.
She had to go.
Yeah.
Really like you.
Yeah.
This is a cheap one I got years ago.
Really? It's
Yeah.
lovely.
Thank you. Just give it another minute. So.
It's on the other side of the room, so we've got some audience. How about we do that? Feels a bit geometrically
Nice if the cameras do.
unbalanced. Yeah, that way you can work the room. Happy to help. Oh dear.
So we'll just give it one more minute before we start. Taylor's coming back.
In the roundup.
Hey.
Hey. This is coming.
Is he still sore?
Huge.
We'll get started. Hi everyone, online and in person. Nice to see you guys here. I'd like to start by acknowledging we're meeting on the lands of the Pambalin clan of the Awabakal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing connection to country. So thanks everyone for coming. We've got Dr. Jai Cooper, sorry, memory fail, joining us today with a presentation I'm really looking forward to hearing about. What a great abstract, really caught my attention. For those of you that don't usually join us, we'll be doing a quick Q&A at the end of Jai's talk. If you're joining us online, please feel free to put comments or questions for Jai in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. Otherwise, you're welcome to put on your microphone or camera at the end and talk to Jai directly. All right, thank you, Jai.
Sure.
Take it away.
Thanks, Jill, and thank you too for acknowledging country. I will give a trigger warning in that we're discussing eco-nationalism, and of course that's going to lead to some issues around what it means with regard to country. And so I'll deliberately trigger you a little bit at the start, and I'll ask you all to consider the possibility of standing up and singing "God Save the Queen," and how that raises this animosity that I'm assuming that you're like inside. Yet we were asked to do this as kids, Aboriginal people included, were asked to do this, and how offensive, and what that reality of symbolic actions does to our sense of feeling, what goes on for us. And so in this presentation can show the way in which we reify symbolic actions and then make them real. The story of Don Quixote feeds into this. Is there anyone who's read Don Quixote? You actually made it all the way through, Mitch?
Yeah, parts 1 and 2.
The original, yeah.
I would encourage.
Yeah, everybody should read Don Quixote. I haven't read all of it. You can probably watch a summary on YouTube or so forth. So you'll get the notion. I'll explain a bit more about that as we go on. What are we covering? We're going to look at Australian environmental work fair programs, and there's me with hair back in the late 90s as a Green Corps supervisor. Hi ho, we're off with a bunch of young people to do environmental works up on the Tweed coast. We stopped for whales, but we planted trees and pulled out bitter bush and did all those kind of things. We'll look at the concept of environmental racism and also eco-nationalism. So in this, we're looking at what are some of the commonalities or differences between a program which is clearly pseudo-military in nature compared to a bunch of Nazis going bushwalking in the Grampians, reliving the Lebensreform movement of Nazi Germany and thinking that they're being quite patriotic to Australia and loving the Australian bush at the same time. So there's some parallels there. How tenuous are they? That's part of what we'll tease out here. And then we'll also look at the concept of reflexive speciesism. So that came through in data that's based out of my PhD. And this all builds out of Bourdieu's notions of hysteresis and delusio. So Bourdieu's social physics. So a little bit of an introduction to those key concepts. Environmental racism, we've probably all had different exposure to it. Effectively, it's the unequal distribution of resources and the impacts. So the Love Canal example in the States is a classic example of building a toxic waste dump beside an area of marginalised people. Oh, yeah, well, they'll get lots of jobs out of that. It'll be really good for them, but they've got a toxic waste dump in their backyard. So waste mismanagement is one form of it. Another form in which environmental racism emerges is in tropes such as the noble savage, and that that's the way to get back to nature. And there are real and there are fake Aboriginal people. The real ones are the ones still in the lap laps with the spears. And then there's also the concept of wilderness. And this stems out of a Western notion of the nature-culture dichotomy. So Marshall Langton points that out, that the very concept of wilderness creates the belief that there are places that are pure, that should be free of humans, whereas all land you could consider has been occupied by Indigenous people. So the wilderness society grapples with this dilemma of, oh, we've created this notion of pure nature at the same time as, oh, hold on a second, yeah, what do we do with traditional hunting rights or so forth in those areas? So this can be taken a little bit further, and a couple of scholars, this is where I take on two professors. So a couple of scholars have taken this a little bit further. So Gus and Haag looks at the work of the Australians for an Ecologically Sustainable Population and says that this gets appropriated by the new right as a form of, okay, there are limits to the carrying capacity of the Australian continent based on the Ehrlich equation. Impact is a function of population, affluence and technology. And so while AESP says, okay, yeah, we do need to have a carrying capacity, it gets carried on by the new right and they say, yeah, we need to keep out those people. So when we limit migration, we limit it selectively. And even AESP does buy into some racist tropes as well. The Haag presents that. Franklin says that we're moving from this notion of the Britanisation of the Australian landscape. So when Europeans arrived and then started turning the Australian landscape into a to replicate Britain, we're actually moving into this phase where we're Australianising the landscape now. If you look outside, it's like, oh, there are native trees out there and there are bad trees, and we need to make it Australian again. And he takes this a little bit further and says that it's not really, it's starting to verge out of scientific merit, and it's actually starting to become the project of nation building. So it's a symbolic project. And throws out some pretty serious accusations. Some scientists fall under the spell of nationalism and see discourses of nature not as the invention of nationalism, but discourses of nation as an artefact of Australian nature. And in this, he's actually starting to refer to Tim Flannery. So Flannery buys into notions of mateship as part of Australian culture that helps us to deal with the harshness of the Australian landscape. And yeah, he says, oh, they're actually falling under the spell of this nationalism. This is contentious because Flannery himself argues, look, we shouldn't go all out on eradicating feral cats. They're naturalised, they're food for people. It's not a good return for effort on investment if you're going to use your pest management funding. So Flannery's kind of pragmatic about it, but Franklin's pulling this idea of, okay, scientists. And he's arguing that the eradication measures that apply universally to introduced animals in Australia are not so much the ecological work they purport to be, but the symbolic social work of nature. So he's arguing that this is being applied universally, and he's arguing that it's scientists that are doing it. The suggestion that I would make about Franklin's oversight here is that he's actually referring to the media who are buying into this, and also to environmentalists who might not be thinking ecologically. So the Koala Preservation Society that has a focus on one charismatic megavertebrate instead of a broad range of species. Similarly, Gus and Haag, he does make this point, and it's a really salient point. However, he doesn't actually stand up and go, well, okay, what are the limits carrying capacity to the Australian continent? Do we actually have to make a call in that regard? So they're buying into what is a discourse of trying to associate environmentalists, scientists, the field of science with nationalist symbolism. Sorry, I should have given you the trigger warning for this slide. Okay, now this is where this trajectory towards scientists are just, they're nationalists. They're into this, they're bought into the spell. This gets appropriated by the right. And Ferguson points to this, that the new right has not only sought to malign environmentalism using stock culture war motives, but also by vying for control of environmentalism's own key signs. So it takes the arguments of environmentalists and it turns it on themselves and says, you look suspiciously like Nazis, which, if you don't know, of course, is a breach of Godwin's law, the internet adage that any argument between two people will eventually descend into a point where one shouts, you're a Nazi, at the other. And of course, here they are, George Brandis back in 2009, Senator Brandis in Hansard, pointing out how Andrew Bolt, with his cutting insights, has revealed the dangerous antecedents of the fanaticism of contemporary green politics and the Nazis in pre-war Germany. Be scared, people, be scared. The Nazis are coming and they're dressed as Greens. So what if we actually had, rather than all of this semiotic analysis, what if we had a group of young people in a pseudo-military environmental youth program dressed up to go out and do the Australianisation of the Australian landscape and see if they were buying into this narrative? I'd worked for decades on and off in the programs and also in partnership roles in local government and landcare networks alongside Green Army teams, National Green Jobs Corps, LEAP programs, and they ran based on predominantly teams of 10 young people, and you stick them all in the back of a troop carrier and you go out and you do your environmental works, modelled on the Civilian Conservation Corps. So what you could describe really as early Green New Deal program design. The Civilian Conservation Corps was part of Roosevelt's New Deal, and it was to enlist predominantly young men into doing environmental works in parks and building trails and roads and establishing nature for people to go and recreate in, amongst other New Deal programs, a lot of freeway building and so forth. And they did get significant numbers up, and a lot of it tapered off as the Second World War started. So it prepared predominantly a lot of young men for pseudo-military inculcation into what they eventually went into in the Second World War. So there is a parallel there in terms of leading into militarism. In Australia, we've had these 4 incarnations of national programs, and this is globally unique to have these environmental workfare programs, particularly with this nationalistic focus. LEAP was the first one in the 90s. There have been other programs going back to the RED scheme and of course work for the dole. These programs tend to focus more with a traineeship as opposed to straightforward mutual obligation, and they'll be including training and a payment. So they're not sitting in proper employment, and they're not sitting in pure training, and they're not sitting in a separate just as a coercion program. And in fact, in the case of Green Army, in 2014, the coalition introduced the Green Army Act to create a Green Army participant as a separate classification of worker, as opposed to being a worker or a volunteer. We don't ever know why they did that. It's never been actually worked out politically, but it may have been a bit of a red herring to try to establish a different worker category. I was working at the time with one of the major NGOs, the largest NGO delivering Green Army Australia-wide, and I was hoping to do my PhD within the program. So I was looking for approval with the federal government and a memorandum of understanding. And of course, the feds were quite anxious about that, and they wanted to make sure that, I'm not going to malign things. And of course, at the time, Abbott was in, and very much a supporter of these workfare programs. I've met him 4 times on site with Green Core teams, and he was supporting, proposing Green Army, to have a standing Green Army. There'd be 15,000 young people rolling out consistently. As you recall, 2018, Turnbull came in and Abbott was tossed, and the funding for Green Army was cut. It was supposed to go back to Landcare. I don't think the equivalent went back to Landcare. There's always a tension between Landcare volunteers and whether we fund workfare programs or their volunteer networks and resource them with project management funding. But it was cut, and that was the end of it. 2018, the last of the programs. So on the conclusion of Green Army, I lost my job too, because the program was over. And it meant that I could then recruit people who were exiting the program without fear of censorial limitations, and we could have an open and fair chat. And so I recruited team members, team supervisors, some project managers and project partners, but primarily team members and supervisors. Obviously, I tended to get those who had a pleasant experience, wanted to continue on in the industry. It was easy enough to, most convenient to be able to recruit them. So what did they say about this notion of nationalism? And this is where you could just start to see, I started seeing in their data, and I knew it from working with them previously, a little bit of an edge of satire. Look, this is good, this is important, biodiversity matters, we love Australian nature, but we don't take it too seriously. So they were reflexive in their speciesism. And this is a quote from Kyle, who was a Green Army team member. Really hate weeds. I detest them sometimes. Some of them are nice, like Ochna, which is Mickey Mouse plant. You can appreciate the Mickey Mouse type shape of the Ochna fruit. And then he says, I guess you could call it plant racism, which is probably not a good way to put it, but I just really don't like exotic species. So they're reflecting at the same time as recognising that they're applying this racism. Also started seeing participants. This is Bruce, who's a young man from a working class background, single mum family in a working class area of Newcastle. And he managed to go on a trip to America. First time he'd been overseas after finishing his Green Army team, came back. Yeah, I noticed weed in America. Everywhere you went, people had asparagus ferns. There it is, up on, it's here in Australia, plenty of it as well. So you build up this tension towards the weeds and a dislike for them. But it was interesting. When I went to Disneyland, they had Ochna, the Mickey Mouse plant, in a pot, and he was kind of happy to see it there because it did fit in, sort of. So they're playing with a new cultural capital, this idea of, oh, I know my plants, but I know where they're supposed to be and where they're not supposed to be, that plant matter out of place concept. And I'm able to mix and match my location and the object as well. Oh, I think it's a South American weed though. So messing with notions of weeds. So we had others that were discussing, and others went to America and just saw pine trees everywhere and went, oh, hold on a second, that's native here, and had to recalibrate this notion of what is native and what's out of place. And they laughed about the notion of, the common enemy bringing people together. Metus hostilis is we are brought together by that which we commonly hate. And here's Rodney. I found a lot of people easy to get along with. As I said, a mutual hatred of weeds really brings a team together. So we actually had this cross-class interaction, people from working class backgrounds, a lot of different ethnicities, mix of gender. And, you have your tensions on the team when things go awry, but we all hate the weeds together. And here's Vincent. Sort of just had a bad weekend, comes to work on a Monday morning and wants to take his frustrations out. Sort of just said in my mind to the Lantana, I'm going to take my anger out on you today. Don't take it personally. I'm doing my job. There it is. Proof. The Nuremberg defense. I'm just doing my job. All right. Andrew Bolt was right, wasn't he? But you just can't be here. It's the final solution for the Lantana. Yes, definitely. And this really embeds itself. Mitch appreciates that one. Yeah. I have nightmares sometimes, morning glory, as the weed just sitting there endlessly rough. Has anyone ever weeded morning glory? It just goes on and on. And you do. It's like you go home at night and you have the nightmares. It just keeps going. You're trying to sleep with this thing going. Yeah. Okay, so what we saw as an alternative, rather than this appreciation of charismatic, eagles and powerful symbols of nationalism, was what Haraway describes as bumptious kind, making kin. And this sort of allegiance, we didn't mind the bugs, we kind of had to get used to them. So really positive relations with obscure and non-native species. Came through in three ways that I saw it. The second was cosmopolitan humanism. So really seeing that they were part of a diverse group, a mix of people. And thirdly, their relationship to Aboriginality was not as a figure of the past, a noble savage, but it was always about meeting and seeing it in the present through practical terms. So some of the ways in which that came through in the data, Adrian as an example, it's the little things that the world isn't seeing. The snail, the Cumberland land snail, an endangered species of the Cumberland Plains that she takes home, tells about, doesn't take the snail home, but goes home to her mum and says, look, I know about this snail now, instead of charismatic megavertebrates. Kate, who was a Green Army supervisor, herself of Asian background, you're in this melting pot in the western suburbs, real pride of it. It's just natural. We're just a bunch of people. So knowing that that's what you do, you're going to work with a bunch of different people. And Vincent, an example, it was good that my team leader was of Indigenous descent because he taught us a lot about the cultural value of land. They referred to practical actions such as cultural burns and so forth. So they were doing what Haraway says, making kin with bumptious kind. The supervisors had a little bit of more of an attention because they were constrained between social fields. And so Bourdieu referred to the concept of hysteresis, where you have tensions between the pressures of the field of politics, or the field of science, where you're trying to get scientific work done, and then other people who are having their agendas and what they want to do with the day. And also the field of social work, or the field of youth work, where you're supposed to take people off the dole and get them occupied. But the supervisors got promoted by the Australian government. This is the 2017 Green Army Evaluation Report. Contributing to the overall positive experience by the participants was the support and enthusiasm of the Green Army team supervisors. You're very sympathetic initially, says Mandy. You give them the benefit of the doubt, but then it becomes a new one every second day. Getting them out of bed, getting the work, can you do the work? So they're frustrated at the different levels of motivation. The Australian government, it was common practice for the supervisors to go over and above. So the supervisors are being Don Quixote'd into reality. They are heroes. They're being made into these noble figures. You're supposed to go out with your work ethic and you're imbuing this, pushing this into these young people to get them enthused. And here's Simone. Sometimes I'd spend 2 hours a day trying to rabble up dozen participants. I've left my boots at my mum's house, girlfriend's house, I've got my lunch. It was just chaotic. Well, Natasha, who was a LEAP supervisor back in the 90s, just went from enthusiasm and came out of a university degree, got in a bus with a bunch of 10 young people, and I think I had a nervous breakdown. So hysteresis is not a psychological condition. It is a mismatch between social fields. So thinking in terms of social physics, hysteresis is extracted from the notion of magnetism. And when you have two magnets and objects that are between them, as those magnets pass, some objects grab a hold of one magnet, they go to the other, or they might even be thrown out into different directions. So consider the magnets as social fields, and then you can consider the agents as those objects that are being played upon. And of course, you're played upon by the tensions between different magnets, pulled between them. Bourdieu is in this section from Pascalian Meditations, breaks this social physics down, and I've highlighted six key terms out of this section from the book, and you can see the different, I'll go through this with data to show the social physics at play. The degrees of integration of people with their social field. The crystallization of the status. So this reification of how people actually take that on and embody it. The structural double binds. The damned if you do and damned if you don't, by being caught between the tensions of different fields. Internal division, feeling split within yourself. Generating suffering. I mean, you've already seen Natasha's comment there of, I almost had a nervous breakdown. That's a form of suffering. And an effort of transformation that's required to change yourself, or you spring back with an inertia or hysteresis, a tendency to go back to the shape that you were. Degrees of integration. Here's Kayla. I didn't try and get them to fill out paperwork and realising they don't have the literacy skills to actually do the paperwork. Worked out that she had to adjust her approach, didn't know how I'd react, and I'd never experienced it. Okay, I'll integrate, I'll change what I'm doing, I'll adjust my approach as a supervisor, and I can read it to you, that's fine. So integrating with the field, the needs of what has to be done as a youth worker. This is somebody who came out of environmental science and not realising that they were having to do youth work, social work. Then degrees of crystallisation of the status. Here's Jasmine, supervisor. I remember talking to my mum and she goes, oh my God, I raised a social worker. Jasmine had started as a scientist and found herself doing social work. And she realised, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing case management for the kids. So they start taking on this notion of, I'm not a scientist, hi-ho, out to do environmental work to save the planet. I'm actually having to do social work as a youth worker. However, Mandy, structural double bind. You don't have all day there to be the psychologist. You're trying to get some work done as well. You're trying to get these environmental outcomes that are being measured by Boffins in Canberra, as well as getting people to work too. So you're caught between the double bind. And here is the perspective from the team members, noticing that their supervisors, they were really, really good on their plant stuff. They knew their species, but team management, yeah, right. So they were the team members could actually see this themselves. Internal division generating suffering. So for Christine, here she is as a conservationist. This was the big challenge, was becoming a social worker. It was really personally a jump into cold water. I mean, this is almost Bourdieu's a fish, like a fish in water, as habitus, hysteresis, a fish out of water. So when you're in the wrong place, it was a jump into cold water. Not fully equipped, because as an ecologist, I spent lots of time in science, I've done community work, but not to the extent where you're a social worker. And an effort of transformation. Here's Neville, who's a manager, and Ian, who are managers, and they're working with their supervisors. Okay, I ended up not bothering about employing people who knew their environmental stuff. They were better as supervisors because they knew how to deal with people. It's about managing people. It's not about what you know in the environment.
And there's a lot of those supervisors who have very little environmental background at all. So it says a bit for being able to do the social work side. And there's that return, that hysteresis, that tendency, like a phone cord, to go back to your natural shape. Some get on and change their status to become social workers, and then Simone, I love it. I love being outdoors, and I love all different age groups. I admit, I'm probably a bit put off with the 17 to 24 age group. I definitely like the 20 to 60 age group. I don't know, being outdoors. Propagating plants as well. And she goes back after the program's finished and starts going back into the nursery, but it's dealing with the plants that are far more accurate. So what is this, the Don Quixote effect? Back to Don Quixote. You can see here's Adrienne, who is a team member on the Green Army program and actually graduated and then was given a job as a supervisor.
Goes from, oh, I had a really great team. We were all having fun. We were all getting along well. It's good nurturing environment usually when the teams are. Hi, Milo.
So we're having sound issues, but now they're
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Adrienne's come in with this good experience as a team member and then became a supervisor. And I just wasn't expecting the social side, the social work, because you want to teach them everything about bush regen and get all excited. And so you can actually see the swap there. This mismatch of being caught between fields and being on the mission, the illusion of a what's the term? Crusade. So Don Quixote is on a crusade. You may know the story of Don Quixote. He creates the notion in his own mind that he is a knight errant and he is going to return chivalry to the world, save the world from all of this just mess, and it's falling into corruption. And so he creates enemies in his own mind and then goes out and finds them. In a way, we could argue that we do that with nations. We build up notions of what it means to be part of the Australian nation or of any nation. And in that, we have to construct the other so that we can have an enemy to fight. So illusio is that process of constructing the imaginary enemy. We construct Lantana or Morning Glory as enemies to construct the notion of something that we've got to go out and fight. You need that. On a great quote from Don Quixote is saying that to abandon dreams, this may be madness. So to not have that, to not have something, a sense of purpose in life, leads us to a Nietzschean sense of doom. There is no purpose. We killed God. There's nothing to fight for. What's the point of being here at all? So this raises that really fundamental question about what our existence is. For people who stood up and said, God save the Queen, that was something important to them at that time until it became not important. And we've shifted that symbolism and we adopt new symbols to appreciate what it is that we consider to be important. Don Quixote is also replicated in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So God appears in the clouds to Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and says, Arthur, I want you to go out and find the Grail. And they all go, oh, yeah, oh God, yes, stop groveling, all of those things. And they go out and they do a lot of damage. They hurt a lot of people, including themselves, in the process of trying to find this imaginary thing. I don't know, they actually seem to think that God was real when they saw God in the clouds. Maybe they had eaten some mushrooms before, I don't know. But they go on this quest, that's the term. Yeah, they go on a quest to find the Holy Grail. Of course, the French have already got one. We all know about that. And they never get to it in the end. Illusio is this imaginary stakes in the game. And it comes from ludus, that players are taken in by the games in which we invest. And they oppose one another, sometimes with ferocity, to the extent that they concur that their belief, doxa, in the game and its stakes matter. So if you are going to get people to engage in environmental works, you need to get them to believe the stakes are real. Now, there are 3 illusions that you can identify in the environmental workfare programs. I'll expand on these. Firstly, there's a policy conflation between climate change and biodiversity restoration. Secondly, the outcomes in terms of participant numbers is misrepresented. And thirdly, the environmental outcomes are misrepresented. And I'll go into those in a bit more detail in the next slides. Checking timing, 12:40, okay. Firstly, the coalition presented Green Army as a part of their direct action against climate change, but there were no emissions targets that were actually to be achieved. They were all biodiversity targets or youth employment targets. And what they did was they cunningly put them beside their climate emissions. Whenever you do a media release, make sure, and we're starting a Green Army. So that sounds really action oriented. We'll take direct action to reduce carbon emissions inside Australia, not overseas, and also establish a 15,000 strong Green Army to clean up the environment. Clean it up. Okay, so there's no carbon emissions there. And the team members see through this. Here's Adam as a team member. How did cutting down trees, pulling out weeds, help fight climate change? Lynn, as a Green Army supervisor, there's Tony Abbott going, yeah, okay, I've got my climate thing happening with the Green Army program. Yeah, at the time, it was linked to climate change right at the beginning, at the start, but that fell away very quickly. And here's Rodney. He's seen through this conflation. It just seemed like direct action putting in place the carbon tax. I kind of saw it as more reducing the unemployment statistics. And we know there's a pattern there. As soon as the employment rate goes up, they look to try and run a workfare program. Secondly, the participant outcomes. Abbott suggested there would be a 15,000 strong standing Green Army. They never got past 7,850 participants at any time. And they had to count the supervisors as well to try and get those numbers up. And then they said, oh, look, this is our level of appreciation, valuing of the program. A captured program, and they only get a 13% response rate on their exit surveys. Oh yeah, but 88% of the people had a greater appreciation for the environment. I mean, that means 12% of the people who actually responded didn't. They did try to make it look like they'd had these participant outcomes, social outcomes, as well as participation rates. Thirdly, the environmental outcomes. I'm presenting some of the negative sides of this. Obviously, there were plenty of trees planted and a lot of biodiversity restoration that has gone on with these. But the team members did see that there was a lot of damage that was done. We just came onto a site. A previous team had been there. No one had done the watering or the weeding. And so all the plants there had died. So they're seeing that, and it leads to disillusion. They recognise the Sisyphean futility, the notion of rolling a rock up a mountain just to watch it roll back down again. Our plants got vandalised plenty of times, mate. The odd council fellow would run over them and the bags and the plant. Or Felicity, it was just endless, swampy, stinky, really, and we had to go in and do it. Just felt pointless, that one. And then they become resigned. They see the rest of the team and they go, oh, they're not so motivated about it. Arlo describing how other team members would deliberately break the tools so that you've got to go to Bunnings to get some new tools. That means sitting in the troop carrier for another half hour, get a bit of a rest, and giving over to that. And, oh, yes, sweet, I get to sit down. So a degree of resignation. This led to a sense of stigma towards the programs, and also no building of an alumni. The Civilian Conservation Corps in the States has had a long history and an alumni association. We've never had that develop in Australia out of these programs. Fiona went on to try and get project management work, and I didn't want to tell people They thought that I was a gold-bludger who'd been press ganged into one of these. And Dean, no, I haven't seen any of the other kids. I don't know where they went. I think a couple might have been in jail. Serious. What can we learn from this? Well, we've had a series of different programs at different times. National Green Jobs Corps in 2010 to 12, Green Army finished in 2018. We haven't had any program since. As you can imagine, 2020 hit with COVID, it becomes quite challenging to put a bunch of young people into the back of a troop carrier or a minivan and hothouse them, how to, put them in a petri dish. However, there's always some politicians that'll stand up and I've got a great idea. This is Dave Gillespie with me back in 2013 announcing the start of Green Army. Jai, can you come and do a media presser with me? So the pressure is out there. Jackie Lambie, 2019, bushfires, climate change is happening. Let's get young people. They're around the dial not doing anything. We'll conscript them. We'll bring back NASHO, get them to do environmental works. Dean Natali, we need a new Green New Deal. So the Greens calling for that. And here's the Australia 2020 Summit, the final report, the world leading source of low carbon products. It could also be a national green jobs program. So it's always brought up again as something that might come through. So the Don Quixote effect is where the dispositions are not in line with the field, where people are saying, this is what we think should happen, and this is the social reality, and people are mismatched. Don Quixote was trying to return chivalry to the world, and the world didn't want it. And they're saying, yeah, come on, you're a bit of a joke. What can we learn as researchers possibly for that? People take their struggles to be real. Don Quixote is well known for the saying, tilting at windmills. The idea that we fight against imaginary giants. Don Quixote saw a windmill on the horizon and said, it's a giant, and gets out his sword lance and charges the windmill, of course, comes off second best himself. Do we have something that we can learn from that when we're dealing with people who are fighting against windmills? They're taking their struggles very, very seriously.
Thank you, Jai. That was so interesting. And I'm just sitting there mind-boggling at that billboard. What a shocker. Do we have any questions, comments, or reflections for Jai? I'm looking at the chat. If you'd like to also, Kathy has one. She can see she has her hand up. Kathy? No? Maybe our sound has gone again. Anyone in the room while we're waiting for them to wake up?
You're shocked.
I've got a
Bring back passion.
no, thank you so much for that, Jo. That was a fascinating presentation. I was really struck when you were talking about sort of the way that folks in the program thought about weeds, particularly as this sort of something that is really militant. We have to take this on, this sort of warfare. But just the dissonance between that and other experiences of connecting with First Nations folks around kind of care for country, and I'm just really struck by the difference in it. Here's this very sort of militarized vision of participating in this particular area, whereas all these other spaces where it's actually, well, this can be about learning and respect, and I just wonder, what do you think, why is there such a dissonance sort of between the two? What is it that kind of produces such a different response?
It's the political field.
Yep.
It's Tony Abbott wanting people to, you've got to be like this. It's the political field saying, show that militance, show that enthusiasm, and that is exuded through other agents that are more embedded in that field. So it might be the land carers who come down, and here's the team of young people and teaching them, you need to hate this plant. And the supervisors come from science as well. And okay, yeah, you need to hate this plant and take that on. Then the supervisors discover, oh, I'm doing all this other work as well. The participants, there's a spectrum, obviously, within the teams of how much they embrace that. And it does range from an enthusiasm and wanting to accumulate the cultural capital of how to do that work. And then like, oh, okay, if I learn this, then I will be engaging with the heteronymous pole of the field, and I'll learn how to develop the skill that will mean that I will get a job in that field. And so they learn all of the plants and they learn how to do, so they're enacting that to embody the field themselves, to accumulate cultural capitals. The field of conservation biology and even the Flannerys, I think that having this as data is a really good way of saying back to Franklin and Haj as well of, okay, look, people aren't silly. And if you've worked in conservation management, there's plenty of ecologists that go, look, yeah, someone comes in and says, yeah, you should get rid of all the bidu bush. And they go, whoa, yeah. Well, what would happen if we got rid of all the bidu bush? Firstly, the amount of funds that's required to do that, so the energy, the investment return means we'd have to pull it from all the other programs.
The dune's gone.
Yeah, and then the dune's gone, exactly. So there's
Things that live in the bitter bush have nowhere to live.
exactly, yeah. So people who work in the sector learn that, it's okay, there's only so many resources that can feed the field. There's a tendency within the field to go, okay, yeah, well, if we build this up as the enemy and we convince more people that this is the problem, then that will construct the industry as such. And that means more employment for us. And there's a self-interest in pursuing that trajectory within the field. There's the fields shift and change and grow. And of course, as Bourdieu points out, as we get the increase with a crisis, we're going to get people go, well, we've got to do something about the environment. And they're going to look for ways to enact that. How can we actually do it? That's why we have people getting super excited about plastics, because it gives people a sense of, I can do something about this, it's tangible. And drawing long bows of, that's doing something about climate change. Kind of, yeah. So it might mitigate it in a little way. And so people invest in the quest to reduce waste, reduce plastic waste, or remove weeds, because that's something to do with climate change. So they want to do something about the environment, because the broader crisis is there.
I have a question from Milo, if you want to have a look as well. He says, working with Bourdieu and myself, I'd be particularly interested in getting Jai to speak about the collective aspects of the team and its milieu, the cultural speciesism or racism parts of the team, and collectively hating the same baddies.
Yeah, it's fun to hate someone collaboratively. It gives you something when you go to work at the day of, you've got all these differences. So metus hostilis, I think, is the really key part. To answer the second part of that, the collective aspects of the team, they're all individual agents, and every team has its own dynamics. It's almost like you can see the social physics play out. There's the field of smoking, and if you have more than 5 smokers on your team, everyone will be smoking by the end of the 6 months. And if you have less than 5, they'll all have given up. So there tends to be these majority dominance things that occur. Gender is obviously one of those really key ones that if you have less than 3 women on a team, that the others will be isolated and often will leave. I've seen Aboriginal teams that are all Aboriginal deliberately to try and create that sense, that collective sense there. And then I've seen teams with a minority Aboriginal where they'll sometimes get through, and then in other cases, all of a sudden, where'd the 3 Aboriginal guys go? it was just said, no, because something got said or happened on the team, and that's not okay. It's a melting pot, absolutely. It's throwing a bunch of people together across cultural boundaries, structural boundaries, and it's all his class. You know, you're all in there together, and you're all doing this rubbish work, and you're experiencing that. There was one great, I didn't bring it up. Some of the participants, you know, like I get on the train in my tennis hat, you know, and my fluoro, and the shame, you know, I went round to my mate's house, and they were really rich. and here I am getting paid $13 an hour and in my fluoro gear. So the stigma that goes with that on a class basis. Yeah, a little bit of pride, but it often doesn't last all that long. They try to exhibit some degrees of individuality within the notion of having a uniform. So they'll do up their uniform for individual expression. Yeah. Thanks, Milo. Perhaps the amplify the collective hating about the wrong species.
Diminishing the hating if the individuals aren't all that interested.
Yeah. Well, are there wrong species to hate? You know, we could hate any species really if it's in overabundance. Yeah, and there are teams that have done work removing Australian natives that are out of place here. So West Australian, and teams often have that. Yeah, it's a common dilemma. Yeah, I've seen teams argue about, you know, do we remove a mulberry because it's been there on the riverbank for ages, and I've always come down here and I've eaten those berries as a kid, and now I'm being told as part of this program to go and kill that thing, and it's a cultural icon to them on their own site.
It's kind of like blackberries in the country. Like,
Yeah.
it's like they're such a weed, but also like all like my mum and my dad have all these memories of picking them as kids and riding horses into the big blackberry put, and it's like but like they're bad for the environment, but it's like this cognitive dissonance. It's hard to hold the two things in your head at once.
Yeah, yeah. You created that notion of the enemy.
And I just had a follow-on comment that a lot of what I'm hearing has so much to do with belonging and how we define belonging between people and in place, and what we kind of use to signify belonging. And also how sometimes to define our own belonging, we have to, like, we do end up drawing those lines about the other and creating, you know, things to fight against and so on. So that stands out as a really strong theme for me.
One that I, you know, probably it's a clash, that duality is with most teams. When I was working with the teams, you'd reach about week 6-month programs. You get to about week 6, and then I'd turn up to a team to do their training, and they'd say, "We hate you, Jai." I'm like, well, what have I done? What did I do? And they said, all of these bits of bushland that used to be wild pieces of nature that we thought were pristine and had these childhood experiences in, you turned them into weed-infested wastelands. Oh, I didn't do a thing. You know, they suddenly could see the weeds that they'd never seen before. We poisoned their minds. And a comment from one of the supervisors, I didn't quote, but yeah, she said, look, we go out to actually make them feel bad. We're trying to awaken them to this problem, and we want them to have that. So it is a dilemma of, yeah, you're taking these places that they adore and that they love, and have had childhood experiences in. Yeah, quite often if they're part of the community.
Question on that, Jai. Did this process impact their self-conception at all? So you have people like Haja trying to make this connection between plants and people, right? Racism against one group, racism against the other. Did this antagonism towards introduced or invasive species ever come into their self-conception where they started to see themselves as being in the wrong place? With their relationships with Indigenous groups, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get you know, straight out misanthropic statements of humans are a plague on the planet and that sort of stuff that's at that extreme. So yeah,
in that way, did it almost dissolve a sense of their Australian nationalism because they had this sense of a hybrid space and of themselves as being, you know, like invasive people in this location, and like, is there a connection there?
Yeah, I never saw, I can't say that they've gone, oh, like I really hate myself out of it.
Like that's a nice, I guess, pushback against this like hygiene argument that we can simply one-to-one make this relationship between the way people think about the environment, the way people think about migrations and movements of people, right?
Yeah.
It's a very long bow that he's drawing, and I think you're pushing back against it quite nicely.
Every time I've said, yeah, they'll generally just satirize it or embrace it. So I presented this the satirization of the plant racism side of things, and then there's other things where they go, oh, you know, like I get right into weed porn. And you know, my girlfriend went to Africa. Could you send me some photos of some African lovegrass in its native habitat? You know, that sort of comment from young people, it's like that's really quite insightful in terms of, okay, yeah, if I'm going to embrace this sense of matter out of place or in place, but what does it look like when it's in place? Where is that place? So there becomes a curiosity of what the other place is.
Do you think some of the discomfort that participants had with being involved in the programs came from the fact that maybe they felt like they were already in a position where the world felt a bit unfair, where maybe they were there because they didn't have a job, or they, you know, it was so they didn't have to go to jail or something. And why is it them who has to do the hard work of physically taking these things out of the land, when like why should that burden fall on them?
Oh, yeah, and intergenerational tension.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't cause this problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and ageism that goes on. Yeah, here's the oldies at the edge of the local reserve, poking their head over the fence, going, "What are those young people doing over there?" Calling the police on them.
Really?
Wow, right on the stroke of one too. They just booted us out. I'm gonna head off. Okay, see ya.